Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pearl and my Bigfoot encounter happened about 10 years ago when I was about 15 years old at the time. The first 12 years of my childhood were exceedingly tough as I grew up with a very abusive father. Ironically, he didn't have any substance abuse problems at the time with alcohol or drugs that you would normally associate with volatile aggressive behaviour. On the contrary, he never touched any of that stuff, which actually meant his inexcusable verbal altercations could not be laid at the door of inebriated intoxication. We lived in a tiny bungalow at the time on about 10 acres of land, and my father's booming, angry voice would literally echo all over the valley, not only disturbing the neighbours, but also the local wildlife that would all make a hasty, frightened retreat from our yard the moment that my father opened his mouth to scream. Everything would upset my father, and it could be the tiniest thing that would set him off, seemingly sparking off a wildfire in our home. Sometimes it was because my mother had failed in her household cleaning chores, like my father would notice a stray cobweb dangling from the ceiling, or the food was not up to his exacting standards at dinner, or there were times when he was just in a foul mood and wanted to vent off a little steam. The trouble is that my father's steam was like that of an explosive volcanic eruption that left chaos in its wake, like a massive earthquake that shattered our lives emotionally into thousands and thousands of little pieces. In short, my mother, my sister Sandra and I were absolutely terrified of our dad. He was never physically violent towards us, for that matter, but the slanging matches in our family home were so viciously verbal, and my father was a master at the art of tearing you apart with his cruel, crushing, vile and indelicate tirade, which was always exceedingly untenable. I would hear my mother literally sobbing and sobbing for hours on end, and it would break my heart to see her emotionally so shredded up. Little did I know that my mother was planning her escape from my father's formidable clutches. My father worked during the day as a logger for a logging company. I think my mother secretly hoped that one of those logs would come crashing down on him so that the problem of my father's unwelcome presence in our home would be extinguished for good. That invariably never ever happened. My mother secretly took on a daytime job at a local diner that my father never found out about, luckily. She would drop us off at her friend's home for the day and pick us up in the early afternoon once her lunchtime shift was over. I would watch my mother squirrel her secret stash of money away and all her accumulated savings, which she would hide under a loose floorboard. She would say to us continuously, "Do not worry, kids. We'll be out of here as soon as possible. As soon as I've raised enough money. I promise you that." I really admired my mother's steely courage and determination. I knew that one day we would leave this hostile environment that my father had created, and I couldn't wait for that special day to arrive. It was the hope on the horizon we all longed for, like a long overdue holiday. One day it happened. Moments after my father had left for work, my mother packed us away in her old jalopy, along with some boxes of household goods and clothes. My mother also left a note for my father which just literally said, "It's over. I've taken the kids." Fast forward a few days and we were living in a trailer park, in a trailer that was literally yards away from the wooded area. Our trailer was in its own private location, and it had been strategically placed in such an isolated spot by the owner of the trailer park, especially for those individuals who wanted total privacy and to keep themselves to themselves. So as you can imagine, this was perfect for my mother, who wanted to keep a very low profile, far away from prying eyes and gossiping tongues. My mother literally transformed the inside of our trailer into a cosy, sumptuous, beautiful den with pretty soft furnishings and comfortable beds that my mother had been given by a very generous friend of hers. For the first time in our lives, our home was filled with joyful laughter. It really felt like that ominous, dark thundercloud that hung over our lives for so long, like a poisonous viper, had been miraculously lifted, only to be replaced by the beautiful warm sunshine. We were so happy, feeling as free and light as beautiful resplendent butterflies emerging from our cocoons for the very first time to face a bright new colourful world that we were itching to explore. However, things were not all hunky-dory for us, as unfortunately money was naturally always very tight. When you walked through the wooded area of the trailer park that was full of large, magnificent oaks, maples, gum, pawpaw and pear trees, and the floor was scattered prettily with ferns, moss, lichen and rambling wild flowers, as you reached the end of the woods, you would invariably come to a dirt road on the other side. That was where people would take a shortcut to the nearby town or the local school. We were to discover that this was a spot where animals would sometimes tragically lose their lives to fast-moving cars, so there was always roadkill on those roads, usually seen in the early hours of the morning. My mother would ask me to go and check every morning to see if there was a deer lying there, or some other dead creature that we could possibly eat as a free food source. If it was a deer, my mother would literally pick it up in her car and bring it back to the trailer. I did not like the idea of eating roadkill much, but my mother had an amazing way with cooking, and she did know how to turn some dead deer or a rabbit into a delectable, delicious dish. But we naturally drew the line at eating skunks, pets, coyotes, rats and stuff like that. However, deers, hogs, rabbits and turkeys were definitely allowed on the menu, provided of course that they were fresh. It was almost like we had hunted the animal ourselves, only the manner of death was far less pleasant for the poor creature. One morning I got up very early, after I'd been awoken by the alarm, to check if there was any roadkill. If I left it too late, the authorities would come along to remove the dead carcass off the road and to clean it all up. So I needed to rise very early. I put on my sneakers, on my jeans and my t-shirt, and reached for my flashlight, because even though the morning had broken, there was a vague light dawning over the valley. It would invariably still be very dark in those woods. I walked through the woods, enjoying the early morning breeze on my face, and then I crossed the dirt road, noticing the familiar furry bump lying in the road. It was a rabbit. I was just about to reach for the dead carcass with my gloved hand, when a huge, hairy humanoid hand got to the rabbit first, grabbing the furry creature in a churlish way. Startled and surprised, I looked up to see whom the owner of this massive hand was, and I could not believe what I was actually seeing. Towering over me like the Leaning Tower of Pisa was the most massive, hairy humanoid ape. I had never seen or heard a creature like this before, that looked more mythical than real, but it stood before me, larger than life. It was a monstrous humanoid ape, and it was covered with long, flowing red-brown hair that gleamed in the early morning shafts of the aurora, that lit up the auburn tints of his beautiful, somewhat tangled hair. I had never seen such a massive, majestic and powerful creature like this before, that was so intimidating that I sensed literally had the presence of an apex predator, much like a lion or a rhino. I believe this hairy humanoid was about 9 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 5 feet wide, with every part of his body simply ripped with dense muscles, making him appear athletic, fit, agile, and exceedingly strong. I did not know whether to scream or run away as fast as I could. My reaction to this creature surprised even me. I remember I just said to the strange hairy humanoid, "You have it. It's fine by me. You must have it." The creature just looked at me, seemingly startled by the nonchalant tone of my voice. I remember its cone-shaped head moved to the left and to the right and from side to side, as if he was thinking about something. He even scratched his head for a moment with his left hand, in a gesture of deep contemplation. Then the creature did the most extraordinary, generous thing. He reached out and literally handed me the rabbit, which I reluctantly took because he was so eager to give it to me. He was so gladdened that I had taken the rabbit from him, and he made a couple of happy, chattering sounds. For a moment we both stood there, frozen in time, locked in each other's eyes. I could feel the warmth from this creature literally flood over me like a pleasant sunshine, circulating through my body with a feeling of great euphoria. Nothing had ever made me feel this ecstatic before. I had truly felt an incredible connection with this mysterious creature, and I literally watched in awe as it glided away on its long legs with extraordinary grace into the woods, turning around a few times to look back at me. It truly felt that in that moment we had become firm friends. It was so weird because I walked back home with such a joyful skip in my step, but I was almost certain that something or someone was actually watching me and even following me. I could almost hear their footsteps on the ground behind me, but I didn't care because I was so incredibly happy, and nothing on this day could get me down. My mother was quick to note my happy countenance and commented on my great mood that day. "I think this early morning exercise is doing you so much good," she laughed. "You really have such a radiant glow to your face. If I didn't know any better, I would swear you'd fallen in love." I remember flushing bright red with embarrassment, wondering what my mother would actually think, that I had warm feelings towards a hairy ape, but definitely not in a romantic way, of course. I secretly imagined how my mother would react if I brought the creature home for a rabbit dinner. I think she would scream in terror. That thought made me laugh out loud, and I actually did. My mother smiled at me brightly. "You really are in a happy mood today," she said. "It's been so long since we've been this content with our lives. It's been hard on you and your sister, putting up with your father's draconian tongue." It seemed like our happiness was short-lived, almost as if we had tempted fate by mentioning my father at all, because later that afternoon we heard a loud rapping sound on the trailer. My mother opened the door to find my dad smiling at us brightly. "Hello, sweetheart," he said in a very fake, syrupy voice that made me want to throw up violently. "How did you find us?" said my mother, sounding mortified to see my father. "A private detective, of course," chuckled my father nefariously. "You think I was going to let you steal the kids away from me, right under my nose? They are my children too. I have rights as their father." "Well, fight me for them," snapped my mother, "in the divorce courts." "Oh, believe me, sweetheart, I will," he said, "with everything I've got." "I don't want to live with you, Dad," shouted my sister, who had never ever had the courage to confront my father before. "You're a horrible man, Dad, and I really hate you. I never ever want to live with you." "Neither do I, Dad," I said suddenly, finding my voice. "I'd rather be locked up in a prison for life than spend another day with you under your roof." My father became furiously angry. "If that's the way you all feel, then I'm done with the lot of you. I'll divorce the whole lot of you because you're a nasty, vindictive bunch," he said, "and I'm done with you all." We were so glad to see him go. We watched him stomping off in a huge rage and cursing under his breath. We heard him slamming the car door behind him and whizzing through the trailer park at lightning speed. And that was the last that we ever saw of him, I'm glad to say. Although my sister did once see him, many years later, holding a poor woman's hand in Walmart, doing some grocery shopping, but the woman looked like a picture of misery, so I can only imagine what the poor woman was going through. Within days of my encounter with the glorious hairy humanoid, we started to receive dozens of dead animal carcasses on our door that were not always roadkill, but creatures that had been purposely killed, especially for us. On many occasions we found a dead deer lying on our doorstep, a hog or a rabbit, and I knew that they were gifts from the hairy ape-like humanoid who seemed to know exactly what meat humans like to eat. I realized he had watched me go home that day that I'd encountered him, and I sensed that something had been following me. It was obviously him. My mother never understood who the supplier of these furry gifts was, and I never ever told her. I did encounter the hairy humanoid myself on several occasions in the wood, when he would miraculously come to me out of the shadows, and he would always chatter excitedly, and I would talk back to him, just as I'm talking to you now. Even though we spoke different languages, there was an ineffable understanding between the two of us. When I realized that he was a Bigfoot from my research that I did online, I began to realize how truly privileged I was to have such an extraordinary relationship with this elusive beast known as Bigfoot, Yeti or Hairy Man. But I never ever had any intention of sharing my amazing story with anyone, not only because people might disbelieve my incredible claims, but because my relationship with this creature was extremely personal. 4 years after we moved into the trailer park, our family moved to a larger home in Kentucky, as my mother got remarried to a very nice man called Richard, who treated my mother and continues to treat her like a princess. I do go back to that trailer park to see my hairy friend from time to time, but he does tend to move to other areas sometimes, so I don't always get to see him. Over the last few years, I have seen him a handful of times, and I always bring with me a large bag of salted crisps, some honey popcorn, and a big jar of peanut butter, which he absolutely loves. So if you want to please a Bigfoot, don't forget the peanut butter. Dear Sarah, my name is Carla, and I've lived on a beautiful 500-acre West Virginian farm all my life that has been in our family line since the 1800s. It is situated in a picturesque valley consisting of spectacular rolling hills, traversed by an upper river well known for excellent trout fishing, along with plenty of acres of open farmland, ideal for our grazing cows, as well as a vast natural wooded area of both forest and panoramic spectacular views over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Our farm is in close proximity to the Shenandoah National Forest. I live in a superbly constructed brick double-story manor house that is painted in white and has a green copper roof. All the large bay windows and the generous wooden deck areas overlook the most glorious views of the countryside, and there is a pretty shimmering silver lake on the left-hand side of the valley that is in close proximity to our house. This means we can literally observe the wildlife congregating at the water to drink, and we have also seen rare species of bird over there. I grew up on this farm with my brother Douglas and my parents, who raised cattle, chicken and pigs. My parents are older now, but they still live on the land in their own little small quaint bungalow that my husband built for them according to my mother's fastidious specifications. My father occasionally helps my husband with raising our livestock, and despite his advancing years, he enjoys remaining as active as he possibly can. He is always helping out on the farm and taking particular good care of our prize-winning bull Boris, who is a very handsome, strapping character and is fully aware of just how good-looking he actually is, and I assure you that there is not a cow on our pastures that does not fancy him to death and desire to have his genes flowing through their future offspring. My brother Douglas was never ever interested in farming, so he lives and works in Washington with his family and has very little interest in farming at all, but is a successful broker in the city doing a job that he really, really loves. I am married to a very laid-back, easygoing man called Fred, who's a very skilled cattle farmer, and we have 2 children, Haley, who's 12, and Eric, who's 15. I'm fortunate enough to have never left my childhood home, but am so privileged to be continuing my father's legacy of raising cows on our land. I am passionate about cows, which I believe are underrated by so many who overlook the fact that these creatures are truly wonderful, with such individual, quirky personalities. Growing up as a child, I have seen and heard things on our farm that I could never, ever rationally explain. As a young girl, I grew up loving the vast open spaces where we lived, and being very involved in the general affairs of a working farm, as we all pulled our weight together as a family and did our level best to make things run smoothly and spontaneously. I was homeschooled by my mother, which meant that I had plenty of extra time to go exploring as a young girl, and believe me, despite the huge acreage on our farm, I literally knew the whole place like the back of my hand, with the exception, of course, of the vast areas of natural forest that my father actively discouraged me from exploring. At the time, I thought he was worried about the plethora of wild animals that lived in these overgrown areas of tall, majestic trees and underlying thicket. I was never allowed to go into these woods without being accompanied by a parent or without the supervision of my brother. When I was a little girl of about 10 years old, I do remember complaining to my parents about an enormous hairy face with red glowing eyes staring at me through the window at night, which was 8 feet off the ground. I would run into my parents' room screaming and telling them that I'd seen a horrible monster smiling at me through the window. I was utterly terrified by what I'd seen, because the creature was so terrifying. My parents kept reassuring me that I was just imagining things and that I'd just had a very bad dream. I began to be completely convinced that they were absolutely right, but I would always wish that those horrible nightmares would go away. Around about the same time that I was seeing this strange creature at my window on a very regular basis, my parents would find strange but pretty feathers in many colours literally placed directly on my outer window ledge, as if someone had left them there purposely for me, like some kind of a gift. On one occasion my father grew very alarmed when he actually found a single 16-inch footprint outside my bedroom window, which he could not rationally explain, because what human being has feet that big? The strange footprint concerned him for a long while, but it was soon forgotten by the affairs of the farm. There were nights on our farm that we would hear strange calls in the valley, which we could never ever identify. Growing up in this part of the world, you tend to know specifically all the calls of the local wildlife that you hear, from owls to coyotes, but sometimes we would hear strange sounds that reminded us of primate calls. Every so often there were calls that were so menacing that sounded like a woman being murdered. It would always scare me half to death when I heard those horrifyingly terrifying sounds, because they were so ethereal and airy, they appeared more supernatural in their origins than something from this world. My mother at the time was convinced that our woods were actually haunted. One evening, when she heard the ominous roars of thunder outside and noticed some lightning sparks flashing across the sky, knowing that a storm was brewing and it would inevitably start pelting down with tons of rain very soon, she quickly dashed into the backyard to retrieve her washing that was still hanging on the line. She started to feel a few wet drops falling on her skin, and as she surveyed the whole valley, the sky had transformed itself into a smouldering grey colour that appeared dark and ominous and foreboding. She started ripping the washing off the line as quickly as she could by stuffing it into her linen basket. She told me she had this horrible feeling in her gut that made her feel distinctly uneasy. Suddenly she saw this strange flashing movement in her peripheral vision. Then she saw him. It was a distorted figure of a man wearing a cream shirt that was rolled up at the sleeves, that appeared to be floating across the outskirts of the wood, and appeared to possess no legs whatsoever. She told us that it was the weirdest thing that she'd ever seen in her entire life, and she was utterly terrified, especially when the face of the ghostly form, with its red face layered in folds of flesh, turned to look at her through those piggy blue eyes that sent shivers down her spine. As suddenly as she had witnessed this strange apparition, it faded before her very eyes, and dissipated into a smoky white vapour, and then just vanished. It was years later, when going through old family photographs, that she recognised one of the pictures of my father's great-grandfather, and she told us that this was the very man that she had seen that day with no legs floating into the woods. I gather that my father's great-grandfather lost both of his legs in a dreadful farming accident and had always overindulged in food and drink, which explained the very pink, puffy face. After that experience, my mother never ever liked going into the woods, and she said on many occasions she had actually fleetingly thought that she had seen, through her peripheral vision, a dark, very large, shadowy form seemingly glide into the woods. She was utterly convinced it was another ghost. I had also seen it a few times myself, and I was absolutely certain she was right. It would always happen so very quickly. Now I believe that the creature that we actually saw slipping in and out of the woods was actually a Bigfoot and not a ghost, all these years later. My story begins in 2014, when we would occasionally lose a pig or a young calf on our land, and it would simply just vanish into thin air, and we could not find it or its body anywhere. It was utterly devastating, not only to the calf's mother, but also losing your livestock to some unknown predator is every farmer's worst nightmare, let me tell you. After all, our livestock is a very important part of our livelihood, but they're also important to us as long as they're with us. They are like family to us. We immediately put up trail cameras on our tree in the areas where we have pasture and where our cows graze. To our amazement, all the trail cameras had been shifted to focus in another direction, away from all our cows, and this kept happening. I immediately began to come to the conclusion that there was a human behind our missing livestock. I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I knew that no animal could intentionally move all those trail cameras like this, as it could only have been done by something or someone intelligent who did not want to be captured by film. I would set my alarm to wake up at various times during the night. My husband was an extremely deep sleeper and would sleep like a baby, so even the sound of my alarm clock barely ever bothered him. I was so determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, and when I had a bee in my bonnet about something, I could not rest until I had resolved the problem. In this case, I had a dogged determination to find out who or what was behind the curious disappearances of 3 of our missing livestock. One night I was awoken by my alarm at 2 a.m. in the morning. I had a feeling in my gut that my cows were in desperate trouble, and the only way I can describe it is a very strong, clear premonition. I am not usually so intuitive, but on this occasion my gut was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. Hurriedly I put on my sneakers, my light headgear, and armed with my rifle, I ventured out of the doors as quietly as possible, heading directly towards the pasture where the cows were grazing that night. I wanted to find out who or what on earth was actually going on. Even before I approached the grazing field, I could sense a menacing presence that literally sent chills down my spine and made my blood turn incredibly cold. I knew immediately that my gut was right, and that something indeed was very, very wrong, and I felt it in every single fibre of my being. I could hear the frightened moos of my cows, and by the way they were thundering around that meadow, made me alarmingly aware that they were definitely in the presence of a predator, and were very, very unsettled. I immediately cocked my rifle and crept behind a tree, and that was when I saw 3 hairless, blue-grey dog-like creatures with strange claws trying to take down this little calf by clamming down the throat area of the creature with their sharp teeth. I immediately wasted no time in firing several warning rounds and watched those dog-like hairy creatures run like lightning towards the woods. Suddenly I sensed that something else was also watching me from the woods, and my eyes immediately noticed a very large humanoid form with glowing red eyes staring at me, and then disappearing suddenly into the woods very fast. It looked remarkably like the ghostly, shadowy form I had seen growing up as a girl. Now I was not sure that it was a ghost at all, but what was it? I could not even begin to imagine. Luckily the calf was fine as I examined the poor shaking creature, whose throat was still luckily intact, although I could see the clear indentations of bite marks. Luckily I'd got there in time to rescue the calf and save its life. The mother looked at me with very thankful dark eyes, and I watched her licking the calf with her long pinkish tongue, trying to reassure the poor frightened creature that was wobbling on its leg, so very clearly like it was so traumatized from its narrow escape from such a harrowing death. I immediately did some research on my Samsung tablet while drinking heaps of coffee to keep myself awake all night, and to my utter shock and disbelief, I was absolutely certain that the creatures that I had seen attacking that calf were actually blood-sucking chupacabras. The pictures I saw online of these strange creatures were exactly what I'd seen in the pasture moments earlier. I couldn't believe that these creatures were actually attacking my livestock, as I had no real understanding of such a strange, very peculiar predator that had an uncanny similarity to the vampire bat. However, one problem kept resurfacing over and over again in my mind, and that was that these creatures, if they were indeed bloodsuckers, where on earth was the carcass, and why had it vanished? I should have found a calf that I'd recently lost just lying there completely drained of any blood, but that had never ever happened. Nothing was making any sense to me at all. The next evening I decided to put a huge bucket of pig's blood into my outhouse to see whether I could trap one of those chupacabras, if they were indeed bloodsuckers as I believed they were. I surmised that they would be drawn to the smell of that blood, and I was right. I am so glad to say that my plan worked utterly brilliantly. Within 2 hours of laying down my trap, I was able to slam the door behind these two dog-like creatures and lock them in. I immediately called my husband, and he was stunned by the strange hairless creatures that were desperately trying to escape. They were scratching away, banging the wooden panels, and making the most strange bird-like calls that I've ever heard, and they also growled continuously. My husband had never seen anything like them in his entire life, and he was utterly amazed that these creatures were indeed chupacabras. My husband went indoors to phone a friend of his for advice to discuss the strange creatures that we had actually trapped, and what we should do about them now that we had them in our hands. Suddenly I heard this huge crashing and banging sound coming from the outhouse, and I ran outside as fast as I could, and I was not prepared by what I saw. There was this monstrous, huge, giant, hairy humanoid breaking open some of the wooden panels of my outhouse and letting out the chupacabras out of their traps. I was stunned by what I was seeing because it happened so very fast. I watched these incredibly fast, grey-moving shapes scurry through the opening and race past me so very quickly, bolting away, that so fast that I barely saw them. They ran towards the woods, and then they suddenly disappeared. The huge, hairy, humanoid, ape-like creature turned around, and he suddenly saw me staring at him with a growing look of horror on my face. I think he was as astonished to see me as I was to see him. What on earth was this strange creature, I wondered. I was so terrified that my whole body literally froze in terror. The creature was so human-like in his appearance, but he also reminded me a lot like an ape. It was almost like he possessed an amalgamation of both humanoid and ape-like attributes, if that makes any sense at all. He was standing yards away from me, and next to him I felt pathetically fragile, small and tiny. This hairy humanoid was covered from head to toe with long, matted, thick black hair that was growing grey in various areas, giving me the impression that the creature was not so young. He was like a 9-foot giant, and he must have weighed about 900 pounds, and his shoulders were monstrously huge, and so were his long arms that literally hung below his knees. In short, the creature was gargantuan. It had a very distinct bullet-shaped head, with a very long face, flat nose and slender mouth, as well as brown eyes with a red twinkling eyeshine that was noticeable in the darkness. I was lucky to see the creature clearly because it was a very dark evening, but the light of the outhouse enabled me to see him in excellent visibility. It was really strange because although the creature was terrifying and made my knees buckle when he looked at me, I have to say that he was more friendly than aggressive towards me. For a moment he held my gaze and moved towards me. I was about to scream in terror, but the hairy hand placed a large eagle feather in my hand that I noticed he had previously had tucked behind his left ear. He made an excited chattering sound to me, as if he was talking to me directly. I really got the distinct impression that he was thrilled to see me, as if I was a long-lost friend that he remembered. Then he walked away, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, and he even turned around a couple of times to look back at me with warm, friendly eyes. I saw him disappearing into the woods, and then 2 figures of those chupacabras came running out of the woods to greet him, like 2 devoted, loving dogs who were utterly thrilled to see their master. I watched the creature with my jaw hanging open the whole time, hardly daring to believe what I'd actually just witnessed. I knew I'd seen the face before as a young girl. It was the scary face that I'd seen staring at me through the window that I believed had been a nightmare, but it had actually been real. He was the creature that had left me all those pretty feathers outside my window ledge all those years ago. I was astonished, and I realized that this hairy humanoid had only ever meant to have friendly intentions towards me. And as odd as this may sound, I began to feel warm feelings towards him as well. Despite his formidable, majestic presence, I just knew that he would always be my friend. Fast forward a couple of months. The good news is that the chupacabras were no longer attacking our livestock and have left our animals well alone. I know that the creature I encountered was a Bigfoot, and he was definitely the hairy face that I saw as a young girl at my window. Ever since I saw him again, he has been leaving me feathers outside my old bedroom window. Sometimes I've gifted him back with presents of jars of peanut butter, granola bars and fruit that I leave on the window ledge. So our friendship has been ongoing, and I have grown to really like this hairy humanoid known as Bigfoot. I know the Bigfoot and the chupacabras work together as a team in what is known as a symbiotic relationship. The chupacabras suck the blood, and the Bigfoot eats the meat. It obviously works well for both parties. These relationships are common in the animal kingdom when animals mutually benefit from their relationship together, like badgers and coyotes, sea lions and lizards, as well as cleaner fish and sharks. The Bigfoot responded to those chupacabras when they called out to him, when I had trapped him. Hearing their pleading, anguished calls, the Bigfoot had clearly come to set them free, and he was the one that had broken down our outbuilding with brute force because he was so incredibly strong. I really believe he turned around our cameras so we could not see him or his hairless blue companions. I believe the Bigfoot has redirected the chupacabras to kill wild animals in the woods, and we have a huge deer and pig population on our land, which he is culling very successfully. But the main thing is that our livestock are now incredibly safe. My husband is very happy that our livestock have not been bothered again, but he did find the idea of my friendship with Bigfoot so far-fetched and implausible, and he didn't believe my story at first. That is until one day he witnessed the hairy humanoid all for himself, putting a really pretty feather outside my childhood window. The whole day, all I could hear him say was, "I'll be damned! I'll be damned! I'll be damned!" I asked him what on earth he was talking about. He said to me, "Bigfoot is real, and this hairy man has a very huge crush on you, but it's fine by me. As long as he keeps those chupacabras away from the pigs and cows, and his hands off you, then I'm fine with the hairy fellow." So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, I live in Spokane, Washington, in a beautiful river retreat home, overlooking a stunning silvery lake, and surrounded by mountainous valleys and plenty of natural forest. So I live much closer to nature than most out here, because when I open my front door, I am truly out in the country. I moved to this part of the world 20 years ago after my company relocated me from California, and I must say I've never ever looked back. My family just loves it out here, and the people in this part of the world are so easygoing and friendly, and when we moved here we were welcomed by the entire community. I love living in this part of the world because the climate is relatively kind to us, with summers that don't get too hot, and you only get a week or two with 90 degrees temperatures, so it's not really that bad. Also, fall in this part of the world is utterly magnificent, with all the golden colours and beautiful pink tones that make the scenic views around here visually breathtaking. And of course, we usually get a beautiful white Christmas, and who wouldn't want that? We have a motto in this part of the world that goes, near nature, near perfect, which really does align perfectly with where I live. We have close access to nature all year round, from hiking, fishing, camping, bowling, water skiing, and of course, skiing. People love living out here, who move from other states because of the lower cost of living, lower housing costs, smaller population, and so much less congestion on the roads. My Bigfoot encounter happened last year during the winter storm called Maya, where the governor called a state of emergency in Washington state. There was a ground blizzard all over Washington, Seattle, and the Pacific Northwest. I remember how bitterly cold it was. There were temperatures like minus 40s, 50s, and even 60s in some parts. I also heard on the news that one poor guy had been left stranded in his car for 2 weeks, but survived because he had food supplies and a gallon of water in his car. I remember here in Spokane it was absolutely freezing, and the whole place was literally blanketed in thick luminescent white snow, and there were hefty snowdrifts absolutely everywhere, and those punneling winds were so vicious and treacherous that even light cars were being pushed over in the area and sliding all over the place. It was too dangerous for us to go outdoors, and especially to drive in those hazardous conditions. I decided that my family would remain snowed in until the dangerous weather actually subsided. I'm fortunate in my job to work from home, and so my cosy, sumptuous home was filled with lovely, warm, crackling fires. My domesticated wife spent her time making us delicious thick soups and plenty of delicious hot chocolates. The kids also roasted marshmallows over the fire and kept occupied with all kinds of board games, plenty of Netflix, and of course watching all kinds of YouTube videos that always keeps them happily entertained, I'm glad to say. One day as I was sitting in my study on the computer, I looked up to see the gargantuan white silvery form walking past my window and looking in at me. It happened so swiftly, I almost thought I imagined it, until I went outside and saw a large trail of footsteps leading to the woods, and they were big. I measured the footprints, and they were 17 inches long and 10 inches wide. I knew the creatures were not human, and as far as my window was concerned, it was 7 feet off the ground, so this creature, whatever it was, I believe was gargantuan. Despite the howling winds and relentless heavy snow, and also the fact that I was physically struggling to brace the punneling punches of this very unkind weather, curiosity got the better of me, and I was determined to follow the footsteps, much to my wife's disapproval. "You cannot go out there," she cried. "You could slip or fall. It's treacherous out there." "I won't be long," I assured her. "I just want to check out on something." I never told her exactly what, though. I will not forget the expression on her face when I reached for my rifle. "What's going on?" she asked. "What did you see out there?" I did not answer her, but slammed the door behind me, and I could feel her watching me with anxious brown eyes as I ventured out into the snow. I followed the footsteps, which came to an abrupt end, just like that. Truly, I'd never been able to work that one out, but that is what I saw. So unless the animal went shooting up into the sky, I have absolutely no clue what happened, because the trail came to an abrupt and sudden end, and the snow from then onwards had not been touched. It was very peculiar, to say the least. I decided not to turn back home, but to investigate further, despite the aggressive, unrelenting winds that pounded my body with their forceful, hammering fists. I found myself coming to a clearing in the woods, where I noticed this exceedingly large igloo-like structure, well concealed behind the trees. I would have very easily overlooked it, but somehow I managed to see it. I immediately went to inspect the structure, which smelt rank inside, and the ground was covered with lots of soft hay. It looked like some creature was using this place like a nest, and I must admit I got some relief myself from inside the structure against the hounding outside elements that were growing more vicious and hostile every single second. It seemed like the weather was getting more and more worse. This was not funny, I thought. I shouldn't have come out here in these atrocious conditions. Now I would have to brace myself getting back into the house, and I knew it would be a hazardous challenge, even just walking a short way. The igloo-like structure provided a huge amount of relief from the horrendous weather, even if the smell was pretty rank. Suddenly I saw a large, white, hairy creature entering the igloo, and when she turned around, she stopped dead in her tracks, looking at me with a look of total surprise and disbelief all over her primate-like face. I think she was more horrified to see me taking shelter in her igloo than I was in actually seeing her. At that moment I did not know what on earth this creature was, that appeared very human in her mannerisms, expressions, and gestures. Yet I knew that I was staring at an apex predator. It was like I was standing with a polar bear in his den, and you can imagine how terrifying that would feel in such a terrifying scenario. You would feel certain that your time was running out very, very shortly for your life on this earth. This was far worse than that, and I was almost certain I was going to be easy pickings for this creature. What had I been thinking, staying in her den like this, I wondered? Did I have some kind of macabre death wish, or what? My rifle was nothing against this thing, and I felt the sense of hopelessness and impending dread engulf my body with a paralyzing fear. I was almost certain that I was a dead man, living on a few more seconds of borrowed time. I could tell the creature was female because of her hairy breasts. I promise you this, though. She was an ample 9 foot tall, and between 9 to 1,000 pounds in weight, and about a hefty 4.5 feet wide. From top to toe she was covered with white fur, with silver tips that were all over her body, except on her hands and her face. Her face was human-like, and her eyes were kind and gentle, although very confused. The creature cocked her conical head to one side, and looked at me curiously with wide-open, brown-yellow eyes. Suddenly she turned around to retrieve a bundle from the igloo door that I'd failed to notice before. It was a small youngling of only about 2 foot tall, which she cradled lovingly in her arms. Now I was really in trouble, I thought. There was nothing more dangerous than an apex predator with her cub. Could this situation have got any worse? Now my life really was hanging in the balance. I could feel my heart racing violently through my chest, and I just wanted to run, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen and paralyzed to the spot, because I was so terrified. I have faced a bear in the wild before, in a very precarious situation, but never once have I felt as incapacitated by fear as I did now. The little cub looked at me curiously and made a strange, cute chattering sound to its mother. And she seemed amused by them, because I could have sworn that she actually smiled. All the time this humanoid ape-like creature studied me with her curious eyes, while she played with her cub's silvery hair, almost as if she was brushing it with her fingers. She chattered to the creature like a mother would on a train while sitting next to a stranger. That is exactly what it felt like. Even though this creature was impressively imposing and very intimidating, it would have been so easy for her to snap my neck with one of her hands, but I'm glad to say that she didn't, nor did she even try. Not once did she give off a negative vibe or even appear remotely aggressive in any way, despite the fact that I was expecting her to lash out at me very suddenly like a striking serpent, but she never did. All the time she remained calm and serene. Even though my presence had come as a shock to her and an inconvenience, she probably didn't want to share her igloo with me, but she never once expressed any displeasure towards me being there. For a creature so elusive, she was incredibly accepting and forgiving. She reached into her straw bed and pulled out a squirrel which she tore into 3 pieces, offering me one of them as a way of sharing and then she shared the rest with her cub. I took the piece of squirrel, and as they started to chew, I pretended to join them by chomping my jaws up and down, as if I was finding the squirrel as tasty as they appeared to be. She looked up at me, seemingly pleased that I accepted her offering. When I was a young boy, my mother had always taught me to eat what I was offered by a guest, even if it appeared to be vile. She told me that the Queen of England would do that, and so should I. I was told that if I refused the dish, I would cause offence to my hosts. In this situation, It felt no different, so I pretended to eat the squirrel, but I tucked it secretly into my little pocket. I could see the creature physically relax, and then she stretched out her long body on the hay with her little cub against her chest and rolled back on the hay as if about to go to sleep. She gestured for me to do the same, because there was a lot of space in that igloo. I lay back on the hay and pretended to go to sleep, letting out a few snores that were all part of my act. The creature went to sleep quickly, and I could hear her gentle snores, and once again I felt safe, and I retreated out of that igloo feeling grateful to be alive. Things could have turned out so differently, I thought. You may wonder why I didn't retreat from the igloo immediately when the creature entered it in the first place. That's a very good question, and my answer is that I was so stunned by what I was seeing that I just could not move my body in any way. It was like I was completely paralyzed to the spot. And in this creature's presence, I also didn't want to upset her, and I sensed that if I did, she could potentially be quite dangerous. I just listened to my gut, I suppose, which is what you need to do in any potentially dangerous situation. I returned home to the furious, unforgiving wrath of my wife, after bracing the formidable elements outside in the snow, and even falling over a few times. My wife was not pleased with me, and scolded me for being away for so long, and causing her so much overdue concern. She also told me to soak in a hot bath, because I was freezing cold, and shaking uncontrollably, and stinking to high heaven of something unmentionable. Well, that's what she told me anyway. It took me a long time to get over my encounter with the creature. I now know that I encountered a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or a Yeti. I would never have expected to see a creature like this in my own home turf, and it was more unusual than most Bigfoot sightings because the creature was as white as snow, and in my opinion, brighter and more luminescent than a polar bear, so she was perfectly camouflaged. I do consider myself to be privileged to have encountered this creature, but believe me, it is not for the faint-hearted, because these things are indeed apex predators, but they are also majestic and beautiful, and some of them are so human-like in their emotions that they can just be almost human. And that's what I felt about this incredible creature. Wow, that really is quite a story. Imagine taking shelter in an igloo with a white Bigfoot. I can't imagine anything more exciting, but also quite terrifying. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Marcus, and when I was born on October the 5th, 1966, my life began with a veil of mystery shrouding it, of which the answers have never been found, leaving me with unanswered questions over my family heritage that I may never be able to resolve. But all these years later, I've come to terms with all that. My strange, mysterious birth is more aligned with the world of fiction novels rather than those of fact, but I assure you that my story is true. I was found lying in a little basket in the pew of a local church with a tiny note pinned to my baby blanket saying, "To whom this may concern, I'm an Irish Catholic immigrant. If my parents knew about my baby, I would be in heaps and heaps of trouble, and they would automatically disown me. I love my baby, but I cannot keep him. Please take very good care of him for me, and make sure that he has a great life. His name is Marcus. Yours very gratefully, Anonymous. P.S. Please let my baby know that he was always loved, and none of this was ever his fault." I gather there were newspaper articles written about me requesting that my frightened mother of the mystery note to come forward to claim her baby, but she never ever did. I was to learn that in those days, especially if you grew up in a very strict religious home, having a baby out of wedlock was highly frowned upon. Today it's so much more acceptable, but back then it was very difficult for many young women. I never held any bitterness towards my mother for literally giving me up. I'm almost certain that she was a young teenager at the time who hid her pregnancy under layers of loose-fitting clothing from her parents, and possibly gave birth to me in a confined space while her parents may have been fast asleep. I cannot imagine what that poor girl went through, having me without any medical supervision, and then having to give me up by whisking me off to the local church and leaving me there lying in a basket on a pew. It must have been the hardest thing that she ever had to do in her young life. I cannot imagine what she went through, not only days after my birth, but months and years later. My only hope is that was not ravaged by guilt, or ended up having a full life and children of her own. Who knows, I may actually have some brothers and sisters out there. I sincerely hope I do. I initially started my early life in an orphanage, and then I was taken from one foster home to another. When I was 8, I ended up in a foster home in Kentucky with 2 parents who I believe only fostered me because of the state benefits they attained for my care. Truly, they did not take care of me out of the goodness of their heart or because they loved children. On the contrary, they would have preferred not to have had me around at all. But I did have my uses, which they took great advantage of, like mucking out the stables and feeding the pigs and the chickens. They were not terrible people in any way, but they most certainly treated me differently to their natural children, like getting me to do all the dirty jobs around the farm and giving me second-hand clothing and cast-offs. At Christmas, I was the one that got far inferior gifts to the other kids. One Christmas I got a pair of socks, for example, and my brother got a train set, while my foster sister got the doll she'd always wanted. When there were kiddies' birthday parties, for example, my foster parents went out on a limb for their real kids, insisting on giving them the most fantastic parties. But when it was my birthday, I was very lucky if my mother even made me a cake. As you can imagine, there were times I felt very left out and excluded. But I did understand that not being related by blood meant that I would never ever be fully accepted, and I did come to terms with that. I was definitely the black sheep of the family, and I knew I was there for monetary gain rather than to be loved or wanted. I did find my own solace and peace growing up, as I diverted my attention away from the politics of the inner family circle, and I focused my attention on the natural world. I adored animals, especially dogs, because they love so unconditionally. They never judge you, and they accept you just as you are, without expecting you to conform to worldly ideals. I also loved the horses, and I adored the pigs and even the chickens on our farm. I had a passion for all the animals, and one time when my father was going to kill one of the pigs for a pot roast, I know it's hypocritical of me because I love pork, but I loved that pig a whole lot more. I took that creature to the woods, and I literally set him free, and I think he knew what I was doing. I do not know what actually became of him, because he never came back to our farm, and seemed delighted to be free. My father believed that someone had actually stolen the pig, but there were reports of a huge massive pig seen rummaging in the forests in Kentucky many months later, so I hope he had a great life and was never turned into bacon, but I guess I'll never really know. My brother Paul sensed his parents were not inclusive with me growing up, so he became prejudiced towards me. Although we did sometimes play together, he grew extremely distant towards me, and we never became close. My sister Amelia was very sweet, but she wasn't interested in anything that involved rough and tumble, but liked to read books and play snakes and ladders, and genuinely preferred to remain indoors most of the time. My foster parents lived in a shabby farmhouse with stables and pretty run-down outbuildings that were all in a dilapidated state and needing money spending on them to fix up the place, which my parents never had. The farmhouse was always in a mess and could have done with some TLC, but they rarely weren't interested in all that stuff. And to be honest with you, neither was I. I loved the great outdoors, and every ounce of my spare time, apart from my homework and doing household chores, was spent in the woods that flanked all the neighbouring farms and stretched back for miles and miles to eternity. They were so incredibly beautiful, and always a place of mysterious intrigue, and where I would spend so many times in soulful reflection, which I did a lot as a young boy. I had a favourite spot in the woods where there was a huge open clearing and a gloriously large creek, where I simply loved to watch the white-tailed deer coming to the water to drink. I always loved their gentle, serene natures, and I never ever got tired of watching them. They eventually got so used to me just sitting there eyeing them and watching them all the time that after a while I became like a fixture and fitting in the woods that they no longer were afraid of. One day as I entered the woods, I sensed that something was really off. I don't know how to describe it to you, but I really felt that something was incredibly wrong. It was like the woods had taken on a menacing ambience, and all that cheerful, pretty birdsong in the valley had all receded, and all signs of life had vanished. I kid you not, I did not see a bird on a branch tweeting, nor did I see a squirrel nibbling acorns, or a rabbit diving into its burrow. Everything was deathly quiet and airily still, and the only thing I could hear was my breath before my face. In all my previous visits to the wood, they had never ever felt like this before. It was like I sensed a very ominous presence of evil. That's the only way I can explain it. I decided to leave the forest immediately. I wanted to listen to my gut, but very suddenly I was distracted by this hefty movement in the brush that got my attention. It sounded like something monstrously big was moving around in the heavy, overgrown thicket. And whatever it was, this thing was huge. It sounded like a rhino or an elephant because when it moved, the ground thumped and vibrated under its monstrous weight. I think in that moment I was more curious than frightened because I was eager to find out what this thing could be. So I immediately took cover. I hid behind the trunk of a very old oak tree to see what would happen next. I heard the creature thundering through the high grass and bolting through it like a speed train on full throttle until he came to the open clearing, which was very near to where I was hiding. I could see this creature so clearly, and nothing prepared me for what I was actually seeing. It was a monstrous giant-like creature standing on two legs with a distinctly humanoid stature. He was covered from head to toe with long silvery straggly hair, and there was a look about him that reminded me of a silverback gorilla. He was, of course, infinitely bigger and was easily 8 feet tall and 800 pounds and approximately 5 feet wide. His head was shaped like a bullet with a very prominent and distinct brow ridge, large, deep-set yellow-brown eyes, a flat nose, and a very slender mouth. I noticed the creature kept looking over his shoulders as if he was expecting something or someone to appear through the brush. This surprised me because I didn't think it was even remotely conceivable that such a powerful creature with such an impressive, formidable proportion of dense muscle and superhuman strength could be in the slightest bit intimidated by any other living creature. I could see that this animal was without doubt an apex predator, without a single living foe. Of that I was certain. I watched the creature quickly straddle the tree trunk as if he was in a dreadful hurry. He prized his muscular thighs on the sides of the trunk and shimmied up its great girth with effortless ease, like a fireman sliding up a long pole. I watched him reach out with a hairy humanoid hand to grab a tree branch, and he twisted his body forwards, pulling himself up into the higher branches of the tree with the fluidness and dexterity of a gymnast. Suddenly I heard the voices of 2 men walking through the brush. One of them I recognized instantly as belonging to the neighborhood farmer, who was a man we kids liked to call Farmer Bruce. I knew that he frequented these woods regularly for hunting practices. "It's usually a good spot to hunt here," I heard his familiar voice saying. "But today, for some reason, it's deathly quiet. Normally this place is teeming with wildlife. There are some prime specimen of whitetail around here." "I don't like the feel of this place," came the other voice. "It feels a little creepy to me." "It's not normally like this, I promise you," came Bruce's reassuring voice. "We could build a deer stand around here," he continued. This would be a good spot because the creek is on the left-hand side, and the deer tend to approach it on this side. I'm not sure about this, said the other man. I'm just not comfortable about the place. It feels like something is watching us. The two men were now literally standing under the very tree where the hairy humanoid was hiding, and I imagine his predatory eyes were pinned directly on them. I literally stood behind the oak tree, only yards away, not daring to move. I was absolutely terrified that even the sound of my fast breathing could be heard by this creature. I wish I had possessed the courage to call out to the men, to warn them about the creature that was lurking in the tree. But I was so incapacitated by fear, and my only thoughts were to stay as quiet as I possibly could, with the hope that I would finally get out of the woods alive. I'm afraid to admit it, I was in survival mode, thinking only about saving my own skin. Suddenly the creature let out the most terrifying growl, and it was unlike anything I have ever heard. Ah! Ah! It was such a dreadful sound that it caused the whole ground to vibrate, and the men almost lost their balance for a moment as the ground quaked. The two men looked utterly terrified. I noticed Farmer Bruce was wobbling violently and clutching his rifle, looking through the undergrowth to see if he could detect something with his beady eyes, but he saw nothing. "What the hell was that?" he cried out in horror. "I told you something isn't right about this place," said the other man. "Let's get out of here right now." Suddenly the monstrous creature jumped out of the tree, landing yards away from the terrified men, with the agility of a domestic cat, but with such a heavy thud that everything vibrated, like the shock waves you get from a mild earthquake. It was just like that. The two men screamed in terror. "No! No! No!" Farmer Bruce stumbled and fell a few times, looking back at the creature like a hunted animal, and running backwards from it as fast as he possibly could, tearing through the undergrowth at a very impressive speed. The other man seemed unable to move, because he was shaking so very much, and I believe he was utterly frozen. He seemed incapacitated by fear. I have seen this behaviour a lot in animals when they're being attacked by a predator, especially with the feral cats on our farm, when they started to pursue a mouse. Sometimes the poor mouse was so frozen in terror, it became an easy target for the cat. Farmer Bruce's friend just stood there, paralysed, unable to move. His Arctic blue eyes became as round and as wide as saucers, and his jaw hung to the ground with a look of horror written over his pale face that had drained almost completely of colour. The creature lunged towards him, whirled his lanky body in the air like it was a Catherine wheel. He went whizzing around and around and around, and then falling over a snapped tree branch, and he became impaled by the thing like a large piece of skewered beef being pierced through a sharp pole. The face of the man became frozen in fear, with wide, terrified eyes and an open mouth that lay fixed in position, accounting the horrified last minutes of this poor man's life. He was definitely deceased, and the blood was pouring from the branch and trickling onto the ground, where it congealed into a thick, bloody gel. Looking at this poor man dying in this way was positively the most horrific thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. I could hardly believe what I was actually seeing. The creature was chattering to itself excitedly, as if he'd really enjoyed the adrenaline rush of killing this man in such a horrifying way. And he licked some of the man's dripping blood off his sausage-sized finger and tasted it. Then what he did next was the most repulsive, shocking thing that I've ever witnessed in my entire life. I literally watched this creature gouge out the man's eyes from its sockets with his thick fingers and pop them into his mouth like they were delicious sweets. He smacked his lips afterwards as if he'd really relished the taste of them. I knew that in some parts of the world they do eat sheep eyeballs, which are considered a treat. But seeing this sent shivers down my spine, and the corpse of the man just looked even more terrifying, with two wide gaping sockets, just staring blankly into space from the tree branch. It was like something out of the most vile horror movie. I was the one now, behind the tree, shaking in fear, and too frozen to the spot to even flinch or move a muscle. I could feel my heart pounding through my chest, and I was so terrified that it was loud enough that the predator could actually hear it. There is no way, I know, of how to still the sound of a heavy, loud, violent heartbeat. The creature slapped the face of the dead corpse as if it was a plaything. And then he seemed to lose interest pretty fast, and I watched him glide away on his long, hairy, muscular legs. And he moved with such agility and grace, and was gone from my sight so fast. But my relief was short-lived. Suddenly I heard the sounds of men's voices, slamming car doors, rifles firing off warning sounds, and then I saw the police. They were creeping in the woods with their rifles at the ready, and there were lots of them. I could hear them talking to Farmer Bruce. "It happened around here," he said, pointing to the spot where his friend now lay impaled by the tree trunk. I could hear the audible gasps as the policeman and Farmer Bruce just stared in shocked horror at the dead body of his friend that was impaled by the tree, and they gasped when they saw the hollowed-out sockets for the eyes. "What the heck?" said the police officer. "How in God's name did this happen?" I could hear Farmer Bruce's voice wobbling uneasily. "Maybe he tried to climb the tree to escape the creature, and he fell." "What kind of creature did you say it was that you saw?" "I didn't get to see it closely," I heard Farmer Bruce lie. "It all happened so fast. I think it was a black bear. I could see this black shadowy form, and I just ran away." "But how did this poor man lose his eyes like this? I hardly think this is the work of a black bear. They don't behave like this in a human attack." "Could it not just be a vulture of some kind?" said Farmer Bruce, offering a feeble explanation for the missing eyeball. "You'll have to come back with us to the station, sir, to file out a report. In the meantime, I'll get the coroner to examine the body before we move it." I want to tell you that I crept out of the woods as quietly and as silently as I could, taking the back way. I was so shocked by what I had seen that I found myself in a state of shock for a very long time afterwards. Even my foster family commented on how unusually quiet and withdrawn I had become over recent days, and they usually took such little interest in my comings and goings, so for them to notice my subdued demeanour was very impressive, to say the least. One night over dinner, my foster father was discussing Farmer Bruce's strange encounter. "He reckons it was a black bear that chased him," said my father. "I'm not sure about that. In my experience, you do not run from a bear, and that's exactly what he did. His friend got impaled on a tree branch while escaping the creature, and he fell onto it. It was a terrible, tragic accident. But get this, his friend's eyeballs were gouged out. Now that's not a bear." "I agree," said my foster mother. "That doesn't sound like a bear attack to me." "Have you seen anything strange in the woods, Marcus?" asked my foster father suddenly. "I know you go there a lot." "No," I lied, flushing a bright red colour. "I've not seen anything." "Can I have more of that cauliflower, please?" I said, trying to change the subject quickly. "I thought you hated cauliflower," said my foster mother, passing me a bowl of the congealed muck. "Oh, no, I love it," I said, piling my plate with heaps of the "No, I love it," I said, piling my plate with a heap of disintegrated mush and stuffing large amounts of it into my mouth to avoid being cross-examined by my parents, who were both looking at me curiously. Now, Marcus," snapped my foster mother. "Try not to put too much food into your mouth at once. It's not a pretty sight for the rest of us to see. You must be very careful in those woods, Marcus, said my father. I know we let you run wild around the place, but there are things in those woods that cannot be explained. Believe me, I know. I grew up here in Kentucky, and I've seen things myself that defy explanation, let me tell you that. Tell them about the time you saw the wolf man, dear, said my mother, nagging her husband. Go on, dear. It's time our kids know the real dangers that lie out there. I nearly spat the cauliflower all over the table in shock. You saw a wolf man? I asked, my eyes growing as round as saucers. I did, said my foster father. As he recounted his experience to the rest of us, he physically started to shake. I realised in horror that my foster father had also had a strange encounter once that had truly ruffled his feathers, so much so that the mere memory of the event was actually giving him the jitters, and for the first time in my life I actually felt sympathy towards him. I knew personally from my own gut-wrenching experience how harrowing his encounter must have been. Go on, tell them, urged my foster mother again. Our kids need to hear the truth. What happened? Asked my foster brother eagerly. Tell us, Dad, please. Well, it was in 1962, when I was coming home from a party. A friend of mine had invited over 100 people to an amazing barbecue, and it was a long drawn-out affair, but we all had a very good time. I had a girlfriend at the time, Angie, I think her name was. She was a pretty little thing, really. But she didn't hold a candle to your mother, of course, he said, reaching out to touch my stepmother's hand. I remember looking at my stepmother and secretly thinking that the entire female population was infinitely more attractive than she was. Anyway, he continued, we went into the woods to get away from the rest of the crowd. I had a flashlight with me, and I liked the idea of spending some lone time with Angie. I bet you did, teased my foster mother. Your father was always a player. He always had an eye for the ladies. Whereabouts was this? Asked my brother. A few miles from here, son, he said. Angie was a giggler, he continued. She just could not stop giggling when we entered the woods. And she started talking all about ghosts and all kinds of scary things. It was because when we entered the woods it was really very creepy. I can't explain it to you, but we thought someone was actually watching us. And I will tell you this, the whole place gave me the heebie-jeebies. It was very unsettling. Then we saw it. Saw what? Asked my brother. The wolf man, of course, snapped my father. Stop interrupting me, son. I'm trying to tell you the story. It was standing there on a branch of a tree, looking down on us with these evil glowing red eyes, and this thing was monstrously huge. He was about 7 feet tall and 500 pounds, and he had the face of a wolf, but he was standing upright on 2 legs like a human. He was covered with thick grey hair, and his mouth was oversized for his face, and when he growled, all you could see was those sharp, white, dagger-like teeth. When he growled, the noise was so piercing it went right through you. The creature started to break pieces of the branch off the tree, and he threw them at us. Oh, and we hightailed it out of the woods as fast as we could, I can tell you. It was the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. Do you know what? Angie refused to see me after that. That was the end of our relationship. Do you think that is what Farmer Bruce saw? Asked my brother suddenly. I'm certain of it, said my father. He's definitely lying about what he saw in the woods. The creature that I saw fits the profile exactly. It would have happily gouged out that person's eyes. I'm sure it was the wolfman that was responsible for the attack. And you know what? Farmer Bruce is not telling anyone about it. He's worried about what people will think. Yes, said my brother, but why did the wolfman not run off with the body to eat it? Surely he would have devoured everything. Maybe he wasn't hungry, said my father. Or he could have heard the police entering the woods and panicked and run off. I sat listening to them all pontificating about the mystery creature that had attacked the farmer's friend. Little did they know I was sitting on all the answers, and they were veering way off course because the creature responsible for the attack was indeed a humanoid ape, and most certainly not a wolfman. I was determined to never tell anyone what I had seen, not only because they would have been unlikely to believe me, but because I felt ashamed that I had not warned those men about that nasty creature in the tree. For a long time I did not visit the woods after my encounter, but I began to miss it so much that I finally overcame my fear. But I always took my stepfather's rifle with me, and I learnt to leave the forest well alone if things became strangely quiet. One evening when my foster sister Amelia, who was 18 years old, one time went for an evening stroll with her new boyfriend in the woods, they both returned home deathly pale, swearing that they'd both seen a ghost in the woods, with huge hollows for eyes, wearing a blue plaid shirt. He just disappeared in front of our eyes, said Amelia. What did he look like? I asked. He was thin and lanky, with white hair, hollows for the eyes, and wearing tan pants and the blue plaid shirt. And get this, he had a huge bleeding hole in his stomach area. It was definitely a ghost, said her boyfriend Kirk. It looked at us and vanished before us. I think you're describing Farmer Bruce's friend, I said to Amelia. Remember the man that got impaled by the tree branch and died? Oh, yes, said Amelia. I remember the story. It must be him. Maybe he does not know he's dead, and he's wandering around the woods. After my sister's sighting of the impaled ghost in our area, there were many other people who claimed to have seen his ghost. So many paranormal investigators over the years definitely frequented the area and claimed to have recordings of his voice and EVPs. Anyway, so that is my story. But I will say this to you. I never remained close to my family. I never remained close to my family once I left home, and we never remained in touch, and I've never ever missed them. Over the years I did get married and have kids of my own, and I adopted a foster child and gave him everything I never had growing up, and I love him as much as all my natural children, and give him everything that I give them. I also want to say that I discovered the creature that I saw in the woods all those years ago was indeed a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. But only then my wife and family knew about my encounter. But now you do too. And I hope you enjoyed my story. Well, I certainly loved your story. What an incredible story. Can you imagine, this poor man being impaled by this tree trunk and dying in such frightening circumstances? It must have been a very terrifying ordeal for a young boy to have to watch something like that. That was quite some story. And to think also that your foster father actually saw a wolf man. I thought that was a dog man. I didn't know you got a wolf man, but maybe you do. And what an interesting story too. That was fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. Until next time. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Morgan. My Bigfoot encounter happened to me in the summer of 1997 when I was 27 years old, with a very adventurous spirit and a passion for hiking, exploring, whitewater rafting, hunting and fishing. One of the places I longed to explore was an area of natural forest with an ominous name known as the Wilderness of No Return. This was a spot in the world that intrigued me, as it was so remote and challenging, which appealed to my adventurous spirit. This elusive, breathtaking, beautiful spot is situated close to the Salmon River, which flows through a gorge deeper than the Grand Canyon, with its majestic waterfalls and fast rapids of white foaming water that spread out into this magnificent river that meanders over jagged rocky outcrops, which are not for the faint-hearted to tackle. Some of this rugged terrain and mountainous valleys are incredibly treacherous and physically impassable, and the wilderness here stretches back for millions of acres with no natural trails, only a few airstrips, and a handful of service roads. I was born and grew up in Seattle, a single son of two very successful no-nonsense parents who always piled on the pressure for me to get top grades throughout my young life. I remember once getting a B for math as a young boy, and my father grounded me for an entire month because he was so disappointed in me. Sometimes growing up, the pressure to perform at school, achieving straight A's all the time, made me feel like a pressure cooker that just wanted to explode. So as a young boy, I found that I vented my frustration and relief through the natural world. I would always find escaping to the country and engaging in outdoor pursuits enabled the caged bird living inside me to be suddenly released and set free to soar the skies on a pair of majestic wings from which there were no limitations or boundaries. My parents never understood my love for nature or the great outdoors and considered such activities frivolous and not of any usefulness, no worldly or material gain. But for me, this natural world was absolutely everything to me and gave my life purpose, depth and meaning. My story starts when I was working in a very high-powered executive job in the city where my fancy office overlooked sensational views over Seattle and the Space Needle. I was engaging in formal business lunches, hosting meetings with high-profile clients, and gallivanting around the globe to places like Singapore, London, and Berlin. My roller coaster life consisted of rushing from one meeting to another and living on my adrenaline surges, inevitably always worrying about so many ridiculous things that always needed to be done. One day, I'd had enough. I told my secretary that I was going away for 3 weeks, and that was that. It was a spur-of-the-moment spontaneous decision that created havoc at the office, but I really did not care. "What about your trip to Berlin on Tuesday? And your meeting on Friday with Mr. Fontana?" she said. "Cancel it all," I told her. I was going, and that was that. There was no room for negotiation in my mind. My mind was clearly made up. I left the offices feeling liberated, with a growing sense of excitement developing in my belly. It was on a shopping excursion the very next morning, when I was preparing for my trip to the wilderness of no return, that I bumped into a friendly, interesting man called Tim, who assisted me with everything I was going to need for my trip. And when I told him where I was going, he asked if he could join me. It was all so spontaneous, almost as if it was meant to be. In truth, I'd not thought of going on this solo camping trip with anyone, but I thought it might not be a bad idea to actually have a companion. Tim had a great deal of experience in the great outdoors, so I knew his expertise on this challenging hiking trip would be invaluable. On hindsight, taking Tim with me was the best thing I could have ever done, and all these years later, he still remains my very best friend. So fast forward to our camping trip. Tim and I were having the time of our lives. We'd been fishing on the Salmon River, catching coho salmon, rainbow trout, and winter steelhead, and we had spent some time whitewater rafting, and there were some harrowing moments when we were flung out of our rafts and braved those terrifying currents that we fought off with all the strength that we could muster, only to emerge triumphant against the ravages of those angry, unforgiving waters. Now we were venturing through the rugged wilderness and forested areas that consisted of Douglas fir, mixed conifers, spruce and red cedars, and believe me, it was enchantingly beautiful. We had encountered some white-tailed deer with their serene, gentle natures that looked at us anxiously, some mule deer that made a hasty retreat when they saw us, and even some elk who really did not seem bothered by our appearance at all, and looked at us with a curious interest. We saw some of the most beautiful birds that I've ever seen, and the birdsong throughout the valley was utterly sensational. There was not a human soul in sight, and we were quite literally in the middle of nowhere, and both Tim and I found this peaceful isolation such a gift. It was on day 5 when we were looking for a place to camp, as we had become hungry, tired, and we were aching all over from the strenuous uphill exertion of our long journey, that we came across a clearing that was so perfect for camping. We stopped dead in our tracks, hardly daring to believe with our eyes what we were actually seeing. Someone had already camped here, but they had deserted their camping spot a very long time ago. There were 2 very bedraggled-looking dusty tents, torn from the elements, faded with time, and shredded in parts. There were also crumpled pieces of clothing hanging up in the branches and tangled up in thorn bushes. Tim and I examined the weathered tents in absolute horror, noticing some brown stains on the outside of the tent that looked suspiciously like dried blood. We noticed 2 backpacks that were still packed, just lying on the tent floor. There was a rusted flashlight that no longer worked, some metal twisted plates, knives, forks, mugs and pots, all lying strewn all over the place. There was a fire pit filled with old ash, and the surrounding stones had all but been scattered. It was a horrific sight that literally made my blood run cold. I knew instinctively that these 2 campers, whoever they were, possibly were no longer with us. I tried to envisage the horrors that they must have encountered, and the first thing that came to my mind was mountain lions or even wolves. "What the hell happened?" asked Tim, looking at me with a growing look of horror on his face. "Mountain lions," I said. "That's my guess." Tim and I examined the campsite with a feeling of dreadful sadness, and we even rifled through the backpacks to see if we could find any clues about the mystery hikers, so that when we returned to home base, we could tell the police what we'd actually uncovered. To our disappointment, we found no information about the campers at all, apart from a book with a name written in ballpoint pen saying Amy Parker. Tim suddenly pointed to the metal plates we had found that had been bent back and twisted to look like rolled scrolls. Who or what had done this? Who had had such strength, we wondered. Baffled by this curious mystery, we walked away feeling rather on edge by what we had actually seen, and wondering in our hearts what dreadful fate had become of those poor hikers. I was hoping in my heart that we would not stumble on any human remains scattered over the wilderness by a scavenging wild animal. Such a thought left me feeling sick to my guts. Please God, I prayed silently to myself, please no, don't let us find any bones. Despite our reservations, we were not keen to end our trip. We knew that everything you did in life was not without risks, and that terrible things do invariably happen to people in tragic and devastating circumstances that are always beyond our control. We were determined not to allow what we had seen to rob us of enjoying the rest of our journey. However, from that moment onwards, a looming veil of uncertainty hung over us like an ominous dark thundercloud. Feeling a little deflated by what we'd seen, Tim and I settled down for the night. We found a pretty little clearing close to a pebbly stream, where we'd seen a couple of mountain goats gather to drink, who appeared not at all bothered by our appearance, but eyed us attentively. We were on a high elevation that I believe would not be mastered by many hikers, but Tim and I were exceedingly experienced and very fit, and really enjoyed pushing those boundaries to our limits. We pitched our 4-man tent and prepared a fire pit. We sat on some large boulders close to the stream, admiring the tangerine sunset that rippled across the sky in twisted folds of varying peaches, golds and oranges. Finally the sunset dissolved over the horizon, and a grey sky emerged, spreading a soft darkness over the valley. We could see the white round outline of the full moon grace the sky, and as it grew darker we were greeted to a beautiful black starry night, made light by the diamond sparkling jewels of individual stars and the twinkling moonlight. We sat watching the flames of the crackling fire, enjoying the snapping sounds of the wood, and seemingly mesmerised by the bright orange flames. For a long time Tim and I said nothing. All was serene and quiet on this enchanting night, and I hasten to say that even the sounds of crickets and owls had all but retreated, and there were no distant howls or cries from a lonely wolf or coyote. Suddenly I got the distinct impression that Tim and I were being watched by unseen eyes. I could feel them on us, and I knew that this was not my imagination playing tricks on me. Believe me, when something is watching you in a predatory way, you know about it. I immediately retrieved my rifle from the tent and anxiously studied the valley with my scope, but I saw absolutely nothing. "See anything?" asked Tim, whose face was ashen. I knew that he had also felt those creepy eyes on us too. After a while all was forgotten, as those menacing eyes had gone, and Tim and I were tucking into a delicious beef stew with dumplings and rice from our freeze-dry rations. Soon Tim and I were chatting about our adventures to date, but no mention was made of that abandoned camping site, which was the boomerang that neither of us wanted to discuss. Feeling overcome with exhaustion from our harrowing day, we went to lie down in our cosy sleeping bags, and it was not long before we were drifting into a blissful world of dreams. I was suddenly awoken to something or someone very hefty walking around our camping site in the very early hours of the morning. Something was crunching the rocky pebbles under their feet. Whatever this thing was, it was heavy. I heard the creature walking away, and I didn't want to wake Tim up, but I wanted to see what it was that had been snooping around our camping site. I quickly slipped out of the tent, armed with my rifle in my hands, and tried to follow the creature as quietly as I could, keeping a safe distance behind it. I could not see it clearly and didn't know what it was, but I wanted to make sure that it wasn't a predator like a mountain lion that was stalking us, especially if it was the very same creature that may have eaten human flesh before by indulging in those two hikers and had developed a liking for it. Maybe it wasn't hungry now, but intended to come back later and ambush us while we were asleep. This thought sent waves of dread through my body, and I knew I needed to take this creature out before we ended up like the previous hikers with no story to tell. As I ventured into the woods, they were very dense and overgrown, and there was a lot of tall, majestic trees. I could hear a suddenly very thunderous noise going on in the woods, and it was like nothing that I've ever heard in my entire life. And whatever creature it was that I was following, it had clearly got involved in some kind of a brawl, because it was fighting. There were two creatures that were fighting. It was a terrifying noise. It was guttural and shrill, and it physically caused my body to shake involuntarily. The creature I had followed was now engaged in some kind of a brawl with another animal. I tiptoed towards a tree to get a better look at it, and there I saw a sight that would make the most courageous man crumble into thousands and thousands of pieces. Truly, I could not believe what my eyes were witnessing. Two humanoid creatures were engaged in a monstrous fight, and they were quite literally fighting to the death. There was no question in my mind that this was indeed a bloody battle if ever I saw one. One of these creatures was like a humanoid ape, and he was covered in dark, long, shaggy hair, and stood very erect in a powerful stance of about 8 to 9 feet tall, and he weighed about 800 pounds, and he was 5 foot wide. He had a bullet-shaped head and a long, hairless, grey face, and a prominent brow ridge, very wide, flat nose, slender mouth, and very dark, deep-set eyes. The other creature looked exactly like a dinosaur, and I'm not kidding, it was the most hideous, ugly, grotesque creature I have ever had the misfortune to lay my eyes upon, and it was covered in a green, slimy, brown, scaly look like a lizard. It stood on 2 feet at about 9 feet tall, 700 pounds, and 5 feet wide. It had the face of the lizard and a crocodile rolled into one, and it had those dangerous crocodile-like teeth that were jagged and sharp, with a long tongue that it kept flicking out of its mouth, just like a chameleon. This malevolent, evil-looking creature with bright yellow eyes had human-like legs and arms that were all covered in these scales, with hands that had sharp claws on them that could rip you apart in literally seconds. And also, apart from everything else, it had the most hideously long, knobbly tail that I've ever seen. As you can imagine, I was horrified by what I was witnessing, because these were two creatures that were seemingly incongruous to our physical reality, and would have been far more suited to a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. What on earth were these strange creatures, I wondered, watching the gory scene unfold before me like a bloodthirsty horror movie. The lizard-like humanoid was hissing aggressively at the hairy humanoid and thrashing his tail violently. He was also lashing out with his sharp claws, trying to tear the hairy humanoid apart, but his talons got trapped in the creature's tangled fur, and he was ensnared for a few valuable seconds that he could ill afford to lose. The hairy humanoid wasted no time in picking up a heavy boulder that must have weighed at least 100 pounds, and with this he throttled the reptilian on his head, using its ragged sharp edges in a purposeful slanted angle, much like a knife. I kid you not, the head of the huge lizard was sliced off in a second, and went rolling down the valley like a soccer ball. The massive humanoid ape started to kick the dead flesh of the corpse in a way that we might punch a punching bag, and it appeared as if he was letting off some pent-up emotion. He then picked up the scaly, decapitated corpse and tossed it over the hilly embankment with a look of sheer disgust on his face. I knew that this creature had no intention of eating the flesh of this dead reptilian, that he clearly despised with every core of his being. They must have been sworn enemies. I watched the monstrous, large, hairy ape-like humanoid gliding away through the forest on his long, agile legs, where he moved with a seamless grace, and then he was gone. I was so paralyzed with fear because I could not believe what I had just witnessed, and it was so hard to maneuver my body with legs that felt like lead weights beneath me. I finally, with a valiant superhuman effort, made it back to the tent, and I shook Tim violently. "We're leaving now," I told him. Tim reluctantly obeyed, but he didn't say a word, nor did he ask me any awkward questions. He knew by the serious look on my face that I had seen something really dreadful. It took us 3 days of camping to get back to home base, and I chose not to tell Tim what I'd seen until we were safely home. One day, a week or so after we had returned, I told Tim what I'd seen that morning, and as far-fetched as my story sounded, Tim knew me well enough to know that I was not making the story up. What were those creatures, we would ask ourselves multiple times over many, many years, choosing not to share our encounter with anyone for fear of being disbelieved and even ridiculed. I was to learn in 2008, quite by chance while watching a TV program, that I had encountered a hairy man, a Sasquatch or a Yeti. But as for the other creature to date, I do not actually know what it was, and maybe I never will, unless one of your listeners does happen to know. My theory is that the lizard-like creature had killed the 2 hikers, and I personally believe it wasn't the Sasquatch, but I guess I'll never know the answer to that. My theory is that Sasquatch may have known that the reptilian creature had killed those hikers, and therefore he chose to protect us by taking down the creature that had developed a taste for human blood. Maybe the reptilian was going to kill us. It would have been nothing for him to shred us apart with those powerful talons of his, let alone those god-awful teeth. It's just that the reptilian creature was so demonic and so evil. You'd have to be there to actually witness what he was like. I've never seen anything more vile in my entire life. And the Sasquatch was imposing and powerful, but it just didn't have that sinister demeanour, despite the fact that he killed that reptilian so savagely. When I returned from my hiking trip, I handed my resignation in at my job, because I did not like being shut in by walls 24 hours a day. My parents never forgave me for my decision, and were utterly horrified when I took up cattle farming, but it's the best thing that I ever did, and I've never regretted my decision. It gave me the space, freedom and fresh air that work in an office invariably never does. I did contact the police about the abandoned tents I found, and it did appear that the 2 people that had gone missing had been reported missing after they had been camping in the area of no return, which truly lived up to its formidable reputation for those poor hikers.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.